Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. This is Chelsea Clary of Clemson University. And when I teach formal logic in my English composition classes, my students tend to get muddled because they assume it's more complicated than it is. In fact, formal logic is about breaking down complicated things into simplicity. I'd like to show you how to turn a written paragraph of prose into a formal logic syllogism and how to analyze why it's presented as prose using the principles of rhetoric. So, What If is a series of articles and a pair of books written and illustrated by Randall Munroe, a cartoonist and physicist, better known as the guy from xkcd. We're going to use a recent What If article as an example to illustrate how we can break down content to analyze its logic, and thus its rhetorical appeal. Here's the article Hailstones. We'll read the first couple paragraphs. So, the question from Michael Grill. My 4-year-old son and I were wondering about soccer ball-sized hail today. How much damage would a hailstorm with size 5 soccer ball-sized hail do? Answer. When you think about it, it's honestly kind of weird that hailstones haven't killed all of us already. I mean, they're chunks of ice that plunge from the sky. Hailstones fall from really high up. There's a popular myth that a penny dropped from the Empire State Building can kill you. The myth isn't true, but for anyone who believes it, hailstones should be terrifying. After all, they often fall from the height of 10 Empire State Buildings. Luckily, the same thing that saves us from falling pennies also generally protects us from hailstones: air resistance. As they fall, both pennies and hailstones quickly reach terminal velocity, the speed at which drag balances out gravity and prevents them from speeding up anymore. For a small hailstone the size of a pea or a marble, terminal velocity might be only 10 or 20 miles per hour, the speed of an object tossed across a room. Getting hit by them isn't comfortable, but it's not likely to cause serious injury. And the article goes on, but for our purposes, these 3 paragraphs will do. So, here's a quick review of the relevant rhetorical principles. The major 3 rhetorical appeals are logos, ethos, and pathos. Logos appeals to the logical mind, ethos appeals to the ethical principles, pathos appeals to the emotions. There are a couple of interesting sub-principles. Kairos, which is timeliness or saying the right thing at the right time and place. And humos, often considered a type of pathos, explores why humor is persuasive. So, anything from slapstick to satire. It's usually considered a type of pathos. I would argue that it's also a type of ethos because knowing what can be joked about and when is kind of important, and it evinces to your audience that you are a person who is thoughtful about these things. So I would say it's both, but traditionally we consider humos a type of pathos. The article structure is based on logos, guiding the reader through the logic that lets Munroe build a good answer a priori. So let's look at how we could break these paragraphs into formal logic syllogisms. Now, remember, a syllogism can be valid, true, or sound. If it's valid, that means the premises, the first 2 or more statements, necessarily logically lead to the last statement. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. That's a big if, though. You can have a valid syllogism about something nonsensical, which is fundamentally what Munroe is doing here. They can also be true, but not valid, if you've got true things in every statement, but they don't logically lead to each other. A sound syllogism is when it's both valid and true. For our purposes today, we're looking at validity. So, here's a nice simple syllogism that makes this paragraph, luckily the same thing that saves us from falling pennies, etc., into a syllogism. Air resistance stops falling objects from continuing to accelerate. Hailstones are falling objects. Air resistance stops hailstones from continuing to accelerate. The two statements, the two premises, logically necessarily lead to this conclusion. This is a valid syllogism. It also happens to be true in this case, so it's sound. If you came here from that assignment I give about creating a syllogism out of prose work, this is all you need to do. It's simpler than you're probably thinking. We can also create a more complex syllogism here, which I've done one, this second one, off of this paragraph. Hailstones fall from really high up. Things are terrifying in proportion to their likelihood of killing you. Pennies dropped from high places are terrifying. Hailstones come from 10 times higher up than dropped pennies. Hailstones are 10 times more terrifying than dropped pennies. Technically, I should probably have the higher things come from, the more likely they are to kill you in here as an additional premise. So I've got here a valid syllogism, although I could probably improve it a little. It's not true because we don't, most of us don't walk around in terror of falling pennies, but it's valid. So this covers our logos appeal. We've got these paragraphs work out into valid syllogisms. But why is it more effective presented as prose than it would be if you just had these syllogisms? And we can turn to the other rhetorical principles for an answer to this. We get some emotional appeal, some pathos, from the charm of Munroe's adaptation to his specific audience. The simple language reminds us that one of the questions is actually a 4-year-old. Hailstones fall from really high up. You can imagine yourself reading this aloud to a child, right? As it's assumed that Michael Grill is going to do. We also have some ethos, some appeal to the reader's principles with these visible footnotes in the second and third paragraphs we read. Unless we're deeply entrenched in anti-intellectualism for some reason, the fact that the author is joining an existing conversation and knows what's already been said on a given subject is a good thing. There's also the premise of these articles itself, that we should use science and logic to get answers to our questions, even if they're ludicrous. That's an ethos that a lot of people hold. We also have a bit of kairos here, because the article was published at a time when we were all thinking about objects falling at high speed. It was posted shortly before the unprecedented near-Earth approach of asteroid 2023 BU. I am actually recording this the day after that swooped by us. The primary humos appeal, remember our persuasiveness of humor, of these articles comes from the fact that Munroe is using logic and physical principles to construct a priori knowledge with an unusual kairos. That is, normally you'd go through this process in a setting with something you had a chance of experiencing empirically. But in this case, he's instead building a priori knowledge of something that's pretty absurd. The contrast between the method and where we expect to see that method creates humor. This is especially educational because the way this knowledge is encoded trips 2 different circuits in your brain at the same time. When you're responding to something both logically, by following what knowledge is being used to construct the answer, and emotionally, by noticing that humorous discrepancy, readers remember it better. You can read more of Munroe's work and find out what that soccer ball hailstone would do by following the link in the video description. Clary out.